we might as well get started. Everybody's time is precious, and I would like to introduce Ione. She is joining us from the lovely Sunshine Coast, the miracle of Zoom. We can do this virtually with folks from everywhere. So welcome, Ione.
Thank you. All right, so I will attempt to share my screen. It might just take a sec. There it is. And I'll put it into slideshow. Can you see that okay now? Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, my name is Ione Smith. I'm zooming in from Shishla Nation territory that's in Sechelt on the Sunshine Coast. And the title of my talk tonight is Regenerative Agriculture and Riparian Area Management. Since it's a small group, I'd like to just say up front, if anybody has any questions or comments as we go, feel free to put up your hand or just unmute yourselves and speak up and ask questions, because it's always sort of nice to have that smaller sort of conversational feel to it in these smaller groups. So please feel free to do that. Just as an outline, I will provide a bit of an introduction and then talk about regenerative agriculture, why it's important, what it is, and then talk about climate change and how it's specifically impacting agriculture, primarily in the Fraser Valley and Metro Vancouver area. And then the balance of the presentation will be around the role of riparian areas in adapting to and mitigating climate change impacts. I expect it'll take about 20 to 25 minutes to go through the presentation. So we've allotted quite a lot of time for question and answer and discussion. So yeah, with that, I will just provide a brief overview. So my name is Ione, obviously. I'm a professional agrologist, and I started Upland Agricultural Consulting back in 2010. So it's been about 12 years now. I started it with my husband and partner, Peter. And since then, we've grown to have 5 staff. So ourselves plus Caslin, who's a research analyst, and Caslin is based in Victoria. And then Sydney Hanachik is an agroecologist, and she's based in Calgary. And then recently we brought on Chelsea, who is a planner based in Vancouver. So the 5 of us have worked together for various years. Caslin's been with us for at least 5 years. We work primarily around agricultural planning, food system planning, research around climate change and food systems. We've tried to keep track of all the projects we've worked on. There's over 70 now in the last 12 years. So we're a pretty busy consulting firm, and we've worked in all corners of the province from, I guess, Nanaimo to Fort Nelson. And right now we're doing a project up in the Yukon. We've also worked in Washington State. So we've acquired quite a bit of experience, and it's allowed us to get a different sort of perspective on local food systems as we've done so. I did want to touch on the concept of food systems. So I always say that this is my favorite depiction of a food system. It's fairly simple. It was developed by the Central Okanagan Economic Development Commission. It goes through some key but important steps. So everything from pre-production, food production, the market supply chain. It talks about Indigenous harvest, foraging, and distribution, marketing, and consumption. And it also speaks to the elements that influence those key steps of the food system, such as education, regulation, policy, research, and markets, as well as the food security and Indigenous food sovereignty pieces. So I think that that's important. And I think that this is sort of a nice, albeit slightly romantic view of what a food system could be, maybe something aspirational in its simplification. And then, when I think of what I would like my food system to look like for me and my family, I'd like to think about shared meals. I'd like to think about backyard gardening, maybe a few chickens, and creating my own honey with my own bees, and getting to know my farmers and sort of having that relationship. And I think a lot of us feel that way, and a lot of us strive for that. But if we're realistic, and I try to be realistic in all of this work because I think it's important, I think if we're realistic, actually, this is what our food system looks like. And I won't even try to describe these steps. But when, as I did today, go to the store to get bananas for my kids' smoothie in the morning, the realistic part of me kicks in. And this is the sort of supply chain and transportation relationship with our food that we're dealing with. It's highly dependent on fossil fuels. It's highly dependent on water from watersheds that are nowhere near where I live. It's highly dependent on policies that have been created by governments that I have no influence on as a voter, and so on and so forth. And so what that looks like is a dependence on people who are working in the agricultural system that are perhaps not being treated properly or paid well. It leads to us all, I think, buying some amount of processed foods, whether we like to admit it or not, and also a lot of food waste. And so those are the things that in our work we're really trying to tackle. But again, with that realistic and not sort of romantic point of view, we're trying to have open eyes as to like what really the influences are. And so with that, I'd like to talk about climate change, because climate change is impacting both that smaller scale food system idea and depiction, as well as that more complicated one. And climate change doesn't care if you eat local or not. Climate change is going to mess with your food system regardless. And so this is a photo, obviously, of the Fraser Valley around Abbotsford last fall, and the flooding that happened. And a lot of people saw these images on the news. It pulled at everybody's heartstrings, necessarily and for good reason. And it, I think, increased the amount of that local food systems was on the average Canadian's radar. There was a lot of money that was contributed. There was a lot of attention paid, but people have a short memory when it comes to this sort of thing. When we're talking about climate change, it's not just about these big flooding events or these heat domes or these wildfires. There's also disrupted hydrology patterns that are a bit more subtle, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. There's an increasing variability in our precipitation. This month, we were just talking about this, Lisa and I, it's been really cool and really wet compared to last year, right? And so in the farming community, the people that I've spoken with right now, that's looking like a 2 to 3 week delay at least in terms of crops. A lot of people haven't even planted their hayseed yet. And I know when I look at my own garden, I'm at least 2 to 3 weeks out planting my tomatoes outside. So this increasing variability is going to be a big thing moving forward. It's going to be really hard for farmers to plan ahead, and it's going to really have a knock-on effect in terms of crop insurance and all forms of insurance, and whether farms can actually even acquire insurance in the first place, because insurance was developed to protect people from things that might happen. But what happens now is that climate change is more and more considered by the insurance industry as something that will happen. These effects will happen. It's just a matter of when, not if. And so at a certain point, farmers' ability to apply for insurance is going to become more and more at risk. It's increasing our susceptibility to new pests and diseases. Bonus points for those of you who can identify this pest in this photo. But that is a spotted winged Drosophila. So that's a type of fruit fly that used to be only found as far north as Oregon. And it's becoming an increasing problem in British Columbia, particularly around berry crops. So these are the types of other impacts that we don't necessarily see in the weather patterns, but that are affecting agriculture as well. And then, of course, extreme weathers and wildfire. We don't see so much wildfire in the Fraser Valley and Metro Vancouver, but in other parts of the province, the interior, the Okanagan, the Kootenays, it's a huge, huge problem. I mentioned some of the nuance in that hydrology piece. So we're talking about typically warmer waters with less snowpack, but what are we seeing this year? This year we're seeing cold winters, a huge snowpack that's just starting to melt. So it's still unbeknownst how we're going to have that impact from the Fraser River freshet this year. Warmer summers like last year was pretty warm and less summer precipitation. So we had lots of rain in the early part of last year and then basically no rain for all of July and August. That has a huge impact on our irrigation demands. Most communities are not set up for dealing with this huge amount of irrigation demand. And then the other thing about climate change is as sea level rises, we're seeing salt water move further and further up the estuary of the Fraser River. So they call that the salt wedge. And that has a pretty insidious effect on soil quality and soil salinity, which also has an impact on crop health. So those are some considerations. I used to have a slide that said by 2020 and some numbers, and now we have to move to 2050. But the fact is that by 2050, we're likely to have 15% less rain than we do right now. In the winter, we're expecting to have 6% more precipitation, but most of that will be rain because we're at the same time expecting to have 36% less snowfall. And so, as you can imagine, that will also impact the snowpack in the mountains and that slower release of water over the summer, which is typically used for irrigation. So this increases our seasonal flood risk in the fall and the winter. One of the images that wasn't widely shared on the news was this one. And this is the one that actually made me have a bit of a panic attack. So this was shortly after the flooding in November that we saw. And this is what, as you can see, the brown is essentially the topsoil moving out of the Fraser River and into the Georgia Strait. So just for reference, if you can see my cursor, this is Vancouver, this is Victoria, this is Georgia Strait. This is where I live right here. So you can see there was flooding that occurred in the sea to sky that pushed topsoil out from Squamish, but a lot of it was coming out from the Fraser Valley and from this part here of Vancouver Island. So as you know, it can take thousands of years, right, for this topsoil to form and for it to all be flushed out, or lots of it to be flushed out in one go, was particularly panic-inducing for someone like me. So this is why regenerative agriculture is so important. I do want to say at the outset, a lot of people are asking, what is regenerative agriculture? It's a bit of a buzzword, I'm not going to lie. Like, there's some political, I think, interest behind the term, and I don't have a clear definition of it for you, but I will do my best to describe what I think it includes. I think, probably 10 or 15 years ago, people talked about sustainable agriculture. It's probably quite similar, although now there's this layer of carbon sequestration and capture sort of pulled it into it. But essentially, it's acknowledging that agricultural practices have a huge influence on our ecosystem services. And so whether you're talking about extensive agriculture out in the interior, like this image of the cattle on pasture, or this photo that I took recently from an airplane flying over the cranberry fields in Surrey, what we do to the land has a massive impact on our soil and on our water and on our air. Regenerative agricultural principles tend to include things like increasing on-farm habitat for biodiversity and species at risk. There's principles around improving water quality and also quantity, so the ability to store water on a farm, to reduce the threat of wildfires by ensuring that forest ingrowth is minimized and forest fuel reduction practices take place. And as I mentioned, maximizing soil health and also that carbon retention and sequestration piece. The latter part, I think, is receiving a lot of media attention, but it's still early on in terms of research as to what practices are able to retain carbon the most efficiently, and also how long it takes for some of that carbon to be captured and stored. So those are some key things to consider. Much of BC's agricultural land, of course, is located on valley bottoms, right? Adjacent to rivers, lakes, streams, and wetlands. And so when we talk about some of these issues, we're talking about the fact that less than 5% of agricultural land in BC exists in the first place. Most of it is what we're seeing here, which is these mountain tops that are full of snow, for example. And so what we're talking about in terms of our land use planning is so critical because we're looking at valley bottoms that are adjacent to rivers, lakes, streams, and wetlands. This photo here is taken recently from the airplane when I was flying back from Terrace, and this is the Skeena River watershed. And so, as you can imagine, right now, as you've probably heard in the news, a lot of that river system is at risk of flooding. And so some of this river, even then, about 3 weeks ago, was at full bank. And so that has an impact also on our salmon and species at risk habitat. just again to sort of show that these small farms are located in these massive watersheds and climate change is having a real impact on them. I mentioned earlier this term ecosystem services. So ecosystem services is just a kind of a fancy term for talking about how the land works for us. When we talk about ecosystem services, we're looking at how the way that we manage our resources can impact human health. Farmland is no different necessarily than other types of land, such as forests, fields, hedgerows, wetlands, in terms of its capability and role in providing clean air, clean water, the ability to store water and mitigate floods, to provide wildlife and habitat for pollinators, to ensure that our native grasslands are protected. This is becoming an issue that's more and more at the forefront as we realize how much grasslands play a role in carbon sequestration because of the soil health within native grasslands. Also, just to be able to minimize the amount of soil that is lost. Again, that photo that I showed you from radar, looking at that soil loss, to have healthy riparian systems will necessarily help to minimize some of those risks. Carbon retention and sequestration, again, I mentioned that's considered an ecosystem service, and then pollination and biodiversity are also key features of ecosystem services. So the photo here on the top is showing a relatively healthy riparian area. The photo on the bottom is one that's a bit more of a work in progress. This one is within the city of Surrey. There have been some plantings on the bank there, but you can see some algae growth and some impacts from local agricultural activities going on there. So how do we ensure that our ecosystem services are being provided at the highest level they can be, to their maximum sort of capability? Some of the best ways to do that are to ensure or to promote beneficial farm practices, or BMPs. That's often done in British Columbia through the Environmental Farm Plan program, whereby farmers can sign up for the plan and receive a free audit from a planning advisor, and then be eligible for cost-shared funding to do certain activities on their farm that will help to reduce their impact on the environment, and also to increase the ecosystem services functioning of their farm. Some of the BMPs that are promoted through the Environmental Farm Plan and to promote ecosystem services include things like reducing soil tillage or modifying soil tillage practices through low-till or no-till opportunities, mulching, so using certain farm equipment tools to just mow down crops, crop residues in the field to produce mulch, looking at grazing management techniques, so ensuring that fencing is in place so that livestock aren't overgrazing any area in particular, planting cover crops in the winter, again, to reduce soil erosion and increase the ability of soil health and organic matter. Fencing is an important one because it can play a role both in protecting riparian areas, but also again in that grazing management, because you can better control where livestock are and when. Replacing invasive species with native species, I'll talk more about that in a second. Improving the health of riparian areas by placing beaver guards around certain species of plants that we'd like to protect, and overall providing that stabilization of the riverbank. I want to highlight some of the work that LEPS has been involved with recently, or over the years really, in Bertrand Creek, which is an important watershed in Langley. So two programs there that has resulted in quite a lot of restoration of that watershed are the Group Environmental Farm Plan for a group of farmers in Bertrand Creek, and a project that I've been involved with called Farmland Advantage. So with Farmland Advantage, we are looking at paying farmers or compensating them on an annual basis for restoring and maintaining riparian areas. And we've partnered with LEPS to undertake some of that restoration work. And so some of the activities that have been involved include putting up some fencing, removing, again, some of those invasive species and putting native species in place. A lot of blackberries, for example, need to be removed that take over the riparian areas. Installation of those beaver guards, as I mentioned, to improve bank stabilization. Just in this last year alone within Bertrand Creek, we were able to help restore over 12,000 square meters of land of riparian areas just this past year, which is really fantastic. And so here's some before pictures. So these are some examples of waterways that are really degraded or that are overgrown with invasive species, such as blackberry and others, and that are really choking that water system and not providing great high quality habitat, and also not providing necessarily an opportunity to mitigate flooding and provide that water quantity piece around storing water. Here's some better photos, some after photos provided by LEPS for the work that they undertook. So the top left picture there is one of those beaver guards that's been installed. There was also some fencing done to keep cattle out of the riparian area, the restored riparian area. And at the bottom there, you can see the plantings that have been put in. And so the Farmland Advantage program is great in that it takes a longer term approach, and the idea is to track and monitor how these riparian areas do over time, and to ensure that farmers keep getting paid to do that maintenance work so that it doesn't revert into a state of invasive species, for example. So I just want to touch on, before I wrap up, a couple of sort of side topics that I think relate to regenerative agriculture and that we're going to need moving forward. One is the topic of resilience. And so to build resilience, I think we're going to need to increase funding for some of these BMPs, specifically around climate change adaptation mitigation. There's been some really good funding of late from the federal government and the provincial government. I mentioned Farmland Advantage. There's also the Climate Adaptation Program, or CAP, and the Environmental Farm Plan. These are being run, all of them now, through Investment Agriculture Foundations. So it's sort of a one-stop shop, if you will, for some of this funding around creating more climate resilience for regenerative agriculture. This group is a national group called the Farmers for Climate Solutions, and they've done a great advocacy job at pushing for federal budget, federal funding for not so much the adaptation part, but more the mitigation side, looking at how to reduce fossil fuel use on farms, for example, and really pushing nature-based climate solutions to be included in the federal budget. And they've been really successful in the work that they do. And what's different there is they're taking a cross-Canada approach in pulling that organization together. The other one I wanted to highlight is BC-based, and it's the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, otherwise known as ACARN. That is an organization made up of research leaders from different academic institutions across the province, where the focus is really on coming together to make sure that the research that's being undertaken is collaborative, that when funding is out there, that researchers are working together on these funding opportunities, and that the work undertaken really brings together different stakeholders, so not just academia, but also industry groups, producers themselves, and government. So that's ACARN, and all of their research is available on their website, and it's a great resource. Some of the work that the Climate Adaptation Group has done over the years has also been really important. So this is another tangential, I think, partner to regenerative agriculture, is the research that's being undertaken. And some of this isn't quite academic, it's more in field, field-based research working with farmers. So everything from looking at what are some of the technologies available for managing extreme heat, to looking at a business case for doing fuel management, and then of course looking at pollinator and pest gaps and opportunities for assessing those. So there's some really great resources out there. They're all free. And so whenever I work with the farming community, I really try to make sure that they're aware of some of these research results that are out there. So last slide, putting it all together. Climate change is here. It's no longer something to think of as a potential threat in the future, and the impacts are only going to become more extreme. Regenerative agriculture and ecosystem services will provide a way to guide some farm activities in terms of trying to maintain and restore ecosystems to minimize the impacts of climate change. But collaborations and partnerships will be critical, and we see that through groups like ACARN and the National Farmers for Climate Solutions group, that collaboration is really important for success. And we can probably become more climate resilient in our food systems, but we'll never be climate proof because of the banana. I blame it on the banana. We're always going to be looking for food that we can't actually get outside of our front door. And so we can only go so far as we can to protect the ecosystems in our own backyard if we're not a voting member of a society that we are relying on for our food, then we can't probably be climate proof, but we can try to make sure that we're climate resilient. So that is it for my slides, and I hope I'm kind of on time. Oh yeah, it looks good for a good amount of time for discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, Lisa, and if anybody has any questions, yeah, I'd be happy to hear them.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Ione. That was great. Does anyone have any questions? The chat I didn't get any questions in the chat, but you're more
I
than welcome.
probably talked a lot quickly and people are overwhelmed. That happens. I know I saw your comment about too much soil. Isn't that a bit of a depressing photo though, really? Like when you see, I know.
All of that soil. I'm also thinking the fish when I see all of that soil
I know.
out to the ocean. Katrina, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, in your regenerative agriculture work, if you've been looking at traditional food systems. I work for a First Nation government, so that's kind of where we're looking towards. And I'm just curious if you've had any experience or any kind of lessons learned from doing that type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So in two different ways. So in, wearing my consulting hat, we've done quite a lot of work with Indigenous communities looking at food systems. And in every community that I've worked with, there's been quite a lot of self-defining of a component around food systems and what is considered traditional or not traditional. And so we sort of look to the host community for providing that leadership on what is considered traditional food systems. But we've worked with, for example, the St'át'imc health services, looking at the 4 St'át'imc communities just outside of Pemberton on increasing food security for those communities. And in that, we looked at some traditional food sources that were mostly around forested, non-timber forest products. We also did a really interesting project more recently with Kitsum Kalem Band up near Terrace, where we were looking at some opportunities for taking some medicinal plants, traditionally medicinal plants, and looking at value-added business opportunities. So for example, looking at cottonwood buds and turning those into salves and balms and those types of products. It really depends on the community that we're working with, though, in terms of the route they want to take. Some communities are more protective of recipes and knowledge, traditional knowledge around the sources of food, which is obviously totally understandable. And then the other way that we've been working with Indigenous communities is with our Farmland Advantage program. So in each of the watersheds that we've been working with, we've done our best to include and integrate some of the Indigenous initiatives that are underway. So for example, in the Coxsilo watershed, we worked with the Cowichan tribes to hire and partner with members in doing that restoration work. And then also in the Upper Columbia River, we partnered with the Shuswap Indian Band on that restoration work there. So those are just some examples, but if you have any more specific questions, I'm happy to answer that.
Oh, I was just curious if that kind of plays into the regenerative buzzword.
Yeah, I know it is a buzzword, isn't it?
Yeah, they all come a.
I think it does. I will say that what I've noticed a lot in Indigenous communities is a lack of capacity. So I think, it's fair to say that a lot of communities are feeling quite stretched in terms of the various projects that they're being brought into. And so sometimes there's a lot of excitement, say, around bringing a community greenhouse up or putting together a community garden, but where it starts to get difficult in terms of actually making a go of it and implementing it is finding people to manage and work within that system. And so I think there's a real need for potentially some skills development and training and job opportunities. And I'll pitch Jacob Beaton's project at Tea Creek, if you're familiar with that, at Kitwanga. So that's just outside of Smithers and Terrace in the Gitxsan territory. He's done a really good job at turning his 3-acre parcel of land into a training ground for Indigenous youth who are interested in working in food systems. He's amazing. Like if you look up Tea Creek, here, I'll find the website and I'll put it in the chat.
Is it kind of like, obviously, I'm not sure if you've been to it, in Victoria, there's the Halliburton biodiversity farm that they have, where they have a bunch of like 1-acre plots where young new farmers can go and basically they get this plot of land where they can practice and learn their skills before
Cool.
they actually go? Is it kind of like that, but
Like
just
an
catered for?
incubator farm? Well, this is, I
Yeah.
think this is sort of like before people are even farmers, they're just interested in learning the skills.
Oh, okay.
But
So
what
like,
you're talking about, I know happens in Richmond, like at the Garden City Lands, for example, and Terra Nova. There are examples of that for
yeah,
sure.
okay.
Yeah. Twassen First Nation also has a really active farming community, and they've partnered with Kwantlen
Did
Polytechnic.
they have a farm school? Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to ask one more question if no one else has anything.
Sure.
So for all the blackberries on Bertrand Creek, how like, yeah, do I really need to say more? I mean, you're realistically never getting rid of them completely. So it's just constant going back and pruning, or did you guys figure out, have you guys tested any other sort of native plant species that can kind of overshadow them to kind of minimize their growth? Like, has there been like any success, or is it just constantly go and just prune back as far back as you can, and that's like where that's at? Or
That's a Lisa question for sure.
For the blackberries, yes, certainly keep pruning. Also digging when we can. And some of the sites are difficult to dig just because they're too steep. But wherever we can, we'll dig out the roots and then come back over and over again to cut them back. And then planting densely. One of the images that Ione showed was a lot of willow whips and red osier dogwood whips planted very close together in order to help produce shade very quickly on the side of the banks in order to help get rid of the blackberries in that area. But yes,
have you guys
come back. But we have also found that a good layer of cardboard with mulch
smothering?
And we've also been working a little bit with core matting, which is the materials that you can get from mattresses when they're recycled, and putting that down, usually about 2 layers of that. Then we're recycling an item. Still requires going back to chop off blackberries that are able to get through. There are always some.
Yeah, that was more a personal question because I have tons of them in my back, like at the beach just behind my thing, and it's just like
a fair question. It's a fair question, and it's why, like for the Farmland Advantage program, we really are convinced that we need to pay farmers not just once, but like an annual fee for doing this work, because it will require maintenance on their end.
Yeah, and it's not easy. It's like yeah. By the time it's the next year, they've grown back to the same size, if not double, it seems.
Yeah.
And have you guys been, I know Scotch broom, it's a huge issue on Vancouver Island, but I know it's been traced now up to all the way to Hope. Have you guys been having any issues with that around Bertrand Creek at all? Because they're like disturbed sites, and that's what Scotch broom tends to love.
Well, Scotch broom we don't usually find along the edges of the creek simply because it's such a wet, moist environment. The broom we do have, and we do deal with it, but it's mostly in the old field habitats that we're trying to restore.
Oh, okay.
Generally not the areas that folks are trying to farm, because yes, they they thrive in absolutely awful soil.
Yeah, we on the Sunshine Coast, I can say we have it here like in horse paddocks and stuff like that. Around the edges of horse paddocks, I've seen it a lot. Yeah,
I was just curious because you mentioned being more climate resilient, and well, the Scotch broom can spread wildfires quite rapidly and serve as a fuel source, right? And so I was just curious if that has been playing in the field. Like, do farmers just tend to leave that then if it's around the perimeter of their paddocks, or are they cutting it back? Or I'm just curious if that's part of the farm advantage, I guess. Is it like,
I mean, that was, if that was found on a site, it would definitely be part of the removal process. I mean, I'll defer to Lisa, but I believe with broom, it's more like pulling it out by the roots and not as,
that we've been trying a bit of both when it comes to Scotch broom. We went away for a while from pulling it out by the roots because the seed bank can be so successful and deep that the thought is that if you pull it out by the roots, you're disturbing the soil and new stuff.
And then it likes it,
more stuff will propagate.
That's happy about it.
We've also been cutting down one site for years, and it still hasn't made an impact on the broom that's there, no matter how many times we cut it. So we're trying both methods. But
I know Machosin, just kind of guess part of the regenerative agriculture and kind of closing the loop. Dave and District of Stuk is looking at too, is actually taking Scotch broom clippings and turning it into like a compost that can be used. So I'm not sure how successful it is yet, but it's definitely, I don't know, something to look at for invasive species along in these agricultural areas and along riparian.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to do it too, for sure.
Okay, I'm done talking now.
Okay, we've got
time.
I don't know who we have from Farm Folk, City Folk, but would you guys like to give yourselves a little plug about the fabulous work you do?
Yeah.
Hey, sorry. I had my camera off because I'm sitting in my bedroom and I thought it would be kind of weird that but anyways, hi, I'm Emily.
No worries, I'm in my dining room, so we're good.
Yeah, okay. I don't usually sit here, but my partner's in the other room, the TV's on and it's loud and all this stuff. So yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I'm so glad to see. I mean, we've seen a lot of like regenerative agriculture topics coming up in the last year or two, but yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I'm glad to see more people doing it. That we've done like quite a few webinars and field days ourselves in the topic of regenerative ag, or like climate friendly agriculture is kind of what we're calling it. But yeah, they all kind of tend to be like the same narrative, I think. Yeah, and I don't know how much people know about Farm Folk, and I don't want to like take over the chat with Farm Folk stuff, but yeah, we have a climate solutions program. So for me, I work in our climate solutions program, and my role is in supporting farmers and ranchers. And so basically what that means is that I do a lot of engagement around, I guess, trying to sort of get farmers to be like thinking about ways that they can adopt climate friendly practices on their farms. So a lot of that ends up being sort of the things that you talked about, which was yeah, a lot of like cover cropping, no to low tillage, enhancing biodiversity around the farm, reducing emissions through like electrifying equipment or just reducing equipment usage, things like that. Yeah, but it's interesting. I find like, and I don't know what your take is on this, but I find that in BC, like, at least with a lot of the farmers that I talk to, they all tend to be like quite small scale and already like, I think if we're looking at Canada as a whole, like the emissions coming out of BC agriculture are like really like peanuts compared to the rest of ag in Canada. So yeah, so it's really interesting. Like when I'm chatting with farmers, it's like, it's more of like celebrating what farmers are doing and hopefully like putting them in the spotlight around BC, just to kind of like showcase like, hey, this is what we could be doing in agriculture, and this is what we could be doing across the entire nation instead of just in, you know, our area. And so yeah, trying to, I guess, just like highlight and celebrate what farmers are doing in BC, because I think our emissions are like relatively low. So yeah,
that's a good point. And that farmer to farmer learning piece, I think because of COVID has really been lacking this last few years. Like any sort of face-to-face interactions, right, have really dropped off. But because there's this new or renewed interest from the federal and provincial governments for funding around this type of thing, I'm really hoping that there will be opportunities for farmers to go outside of the province too. You know, both like BC farmers go to other provinces and farmers from other provinces come to BC to learn about what's going on. Because I agree, the way that we characterize agriculture in this province is very different from other provinces, and we're probably more aligned with something like Nova Scotia than anything else. And partly that has to do with the price of land here compared to other jurisdictions. You just naturally get smaller farms. But yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it'll be interesting to see how farmers can better start to learn from one another about what works and what doesn't work. I think that's a role that a lot of these organizations can play in facilitating some of those discussions.
Yeah, totally. And I don't know if we have any farmers on the call, but I will just plug if anyone wants to get the word out that we are hosting like a few cover cropping field days this year. And then we're hosting a no-till field day in July out in Chilliwack, and intensive rotational grazing field day in Lillooet. So we'll be kind of like all over the province hosting these types of field days and like getting farmers together to talk about these topics. So yeah, if you know of any farmers that you want to pass the word on to, or if there's any farmers on the call, we will be hosting those. So
awesome. And then some of the work that that you're doing, or so I should say city folk is doing, is around seed security, right? Do you want to talk a minute? Do you want to say anything about seeds and seed security? Because I didn't really touch on that, but I think that has a huge role to play in climate solutions.
Yeah, I will say I don't work in our BC Seed program, so I I could tell you a little bit about like the projects that they're doing, but I don't know how well I could articulate sort of the climate and seed piece. I would leave that up to like our program manager David, who is I think very well versed in the topic, but yeah, our BC Seeds program is huge, and they're doing really great work, and they're engaging a lot of folks, not just farmers who are doing seed work, but also like gardeners and eaters, and like they're really engaging, everyone across BC in seed work, which I think is really great. And with our seed and research farm, they're doing a lot of really great trialing. And then of course, having more funding to get like a few more seed cleaning trailers that can hopefully travel around the province and help farmers actually clean their seed is really huge too. So yeah, they're doing a lot of awesome work.
It's really important. And I'm hearing more and more from farmers about the need for figuring out, varieties of crops that are more flexible or resilient to those colder springs or hotter summers and everything that's coming in between. So yeah, banks are becoming more and more, I think, of an important tool and resource.
Yeah, for sure. And sorry,
could be another webinar.
Yeah, a whole other presentation, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. I love it. Are there any more questions? So thank everyone for coming out, and we will talk to you later.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye.
Have a good night.